Hello and welcome to Real Talk Radio. I'm your host, Hillary Raimo. Today we are going to be talking about cannabis and autism. In 2018, the CDC determined that approximately 1 in 59 children is diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. Approximately 1 in 37 boys and 1 in 151 girls. Boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls. Most children will be diagnosed after the age of 4, although autism can be reliably diagnosed as early as age 2. We have a lot of things going on in our world today, and we have to pick and choose where we put our attention. One of the things I would like to continue talking about in my cannabis series is how cannabis can help autism, why it works, what the studies prove, and where we can go forward in broadening our range of treatment when it comes to diseases like this, especially ones that have been popping up more and more and more. I mean, over the last 10 years or so, autism has become more of an issue for people as we continue on. Research indicates that genetics are involved in the vast majority of cases. Children born to older parents are often at a higher risk for having autism, and parents who have had a child with autism spectrum disorder have a 2 to 18% chance of having a second child who is affected. I'm really looking forward to talking about this today with my guest, Janna Champagne. She is a holistic integrated care nurse. She speaks on medical marijuana in a variety of different venues. She works with doctors, clinics, dispensaries as a cannabis staff educator. She's really quite an amazing person. I met her at the Cannabis Nurses Network conference in San Diego this past January, and she's here to answer our questions and talk about this, and hopefully we can cover a lot of ground in the next hour. Welcome, Janna. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Hillary. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, this is an important topic, don't you think, as we face, most of us know at least one person in our lives, or whether it's in our own families or extended families or our friends and neighbors, that autism affects somebody within that group of people, and it's becoming more and more. So why don't we start with a little bit about you and your story and where you come from as far as getting into the work that you do?
Sure. And so I sort of stumbled into this work through personal experience. Back in 2012, I was working at my local hospital doing critical care nursing, and I had a complete health collapse occur in 2012. And I very quickly became disenchanted with the medical paradigm for treating my illness and my issues, and so began seeking alternatives and stumbled onto cannabis as an alternative to opioid pain medications, which, as nurses, we see the result in patients who are using opioid for chronic pain issues. And it's really not a pretty sight. Mm-hmm. So I was very motivated to find something else. And, to my surprise, not only did cannabis alleviate my pain issues, but it also has helped me rebuild my health, really from the foundation up. And, one of the results that's just astounding is that my autoimmune markers have completely reversed, which is actually unheard of with the mainstream approach.
Well, so one of the things that brought a lot of attention to this topic is the opioid addiction crisis that we're facing across the country for a variety of reasons. But when somebody typically goes into a medical situation with their child, and their child goes through the testing and they come back with a diagnosis of the autistic spectrum, somewhere along the spectrum, where does the parent start with even having that conversation about medical cannabis? What if they live in a state where it's not legal? I mean, how would you say a parent or caregivers should go about starting the dialogue with a medical professional about their child using cannabis as an alternative method?
Yes, and as a parent of a child with autism, I really understand that challenge firsthand. It was a few years after I had those profound benefits of cannabis that I saw the results of trying it with my daughter with autism, who had entered a really severe puberty crisis. This is common to about 50% of kids with autism as they reach their coming of age. the hormone imbalances kick in, and they end up with extreme level behaviors. In my daughter's case, very common for all kids that suffer this. She went from being a very sweet and loving and eager to please little girl to having aggressive rages and beating up all of her caregivers and her parents, self-injurious. She destroyed my house, just lots of property destruction. And I'm a homeschooling mom, so I had never, ever considered out-of-home placement for her. But during that really traumatic phase, it was almost enforced. And so, we brought Cannabis on board, and it spared her the added trauma of being taken from her home and family. And now her behaviors are manageable, and she's actually made a lot of functional progress as well. And in that same period on Cannabis, she went from nonverbal at age 10 to now at age 17, where she's verbal and we're having conversations for the first time in her life. She's made enormous academic progress since coming out of her crisis. She's progressed 2 to 3 grades per year in school. And she's taking algebra and geometry, which was thought impossible by the quote unquote experts a decade ago, who said that she wasn't able to learn. So this really feeds into my theory, and it's, supported by research, that autism is endocannabinoid deficiency. And when we treat a child with autism using cannabis, we're actually filling in vital nutrients that their bodies require in order to remain in balance. And knowing that the underlying causes of autism, as you mentioned, that genetic component, combined with environmental factors as well. And the result is imbalances in the neurological system, the gastrointestinal system, and the immune system. And research supports that cannabis can help promote balance in all 3 of those systems. So it's really targeting, in addition to its ability to provide symptom management and ease some of these horrific situations that families are facing, it's also targeting some of those underlying contributors that cause autism. It's pretty profound.
What an amazing story and firsthand experience that you can share with us through this as well, because oftentimes parents don't really want to talk about it. They don't seek platforms to be able to really share their story, but I think they should. So we the people that don't have autism in their immediate experience can better understand it, because what we're looking at really is a surge in this, and cannabis is obviously working for people who choose it. Now, what form did you begin to give it to her? Did you have to go medical routes? Could you share a little bit about that part?
Of course. And so I'm in the state of Oregon, and we are fortunate to have pretty free access to cannabis therapy. Through my own illness, I actually began growing for myself. And when I started looking at the research, and really anybody that's paying attention hears these stories, not just mine, but thousands of stories throughout the United States of parents reporting these profound benefits for their child with autism. And so, of course, I went to my daughter's doctor. It's legal here in Oregon with a medical card for a child, but you do need a doctor's signature. And once we had that, we started her on a THCA tincture, which is the raw form of cannabis, so it's not intoxicating. It's profoundly anti-inflammatory. Research supports that it has 12 times the anti-inflammatory effect of aspirin, which is about twice that of prednisone. And knowing that rampant systemic inflammation is a major symptom and result of autism, it's a great intervention. And man, it eased her behaviors almost immediately. My paradigm is that a child, especially when they have a difficult time communicating verbally, those behaviors represent communication. And in my daughter's case, I believe she was trying to tell us she was having severe pain. In retrospect, I believe she was having migraines with her PMS period every month, and the bloating and the discomfort, and very light sensitive. And so once we alleviated her pain and we heard her communication and addressed it, those behaviors subsided. So it really it's just amazing what it did for her. It really eased our crisis. It kept her in home, and it's not perfect. I never say our lives are perfect, because autism is complicated and our kids have great days and they have harder days. but it's so great that we have cannabis to help manage those behaviors, and we can really meet my daughter's needs flexibly. So if she's having a harder day, we'll mix up her formulations, we'll give her more. And so it really is, it's a really powerful tool for families who are dealing with autism.
Now, not every family is an expert in cannabis like yourself. So when you talk about mixing up the formulas and, adjusting them, how would you suggest parents who have no experience doing that go about deciding on what form or what percents of this or that? I mean, a lot of people don't even really know what THCA and other compounds are. So maybe we should talk about that for a little bit. So you mentioned that THCA is, maybe you could repeat it actually. It has something to do with the purity of the plant, but it doesn't get you high, doesn't have that feeling of being high. Talk about the difference between the THC, the THCA, and I know that when you go to a dispensary, you have other different compound percents on your label. How do we find out more about this? What do we need to look for? Because not all of us are you, and we can't go and say, well, we need to change this and that. So how would we adjust it, I guess, is my question. And what are the important things we should be looking for on our labels from the dispensaries?
Right. And just for information, this is one of the roles that I complete as a cannabis nurse, is that I consult with families, parents of kids with autism, and help educate them and really try to help them take an individualized approach for their child through a partnership where they learn, some of the signals their child is giving, which component of cannabis might be best for alleviating that specific situation, and just helping them to be comfortable and empowering them to go through that experimentation process that's often necessary, because there is a lot of individual variation in response. The other thing, as a cannabis nurse, I feel it's important to mention that anytime you're considering cannabis for a child, it is very important to seek medical oversight, because you always want to be weighing the risk versus the benefit of any intervention, especially with the child. And with cannabis, there are certain components that may entail higher risk factors, and you want to balance that out and make sure that you're making a well-informed decision that way. So about the components, THCA, of course, is the raw form of cannabis. You may hear or read about people who are juicing or blending cannabis leaves, and THCA is the component they're after with that. In our case, the formulation I used for my daughter is a raw infusion. So basically just flour that's been soaking in a carrier oil. In this case, it was organic extra virgin olive oil for a certain amount of time, and all of those cannabinoids infuse into the oil, and then you strain it out and give the oil as the medicine. THCA has no risk factors for use with children because it's not intoxicating. So you don't have to worry about that brain development piece and how that might be impacted like we do with other forms of cannabis. It tends to be a really big hitter, especially for things like pain and inflammation, which we know kind of go along with autism. CBD is another component, or cannabidiol, that a lot of parents turn to with autism. Also not intoxicating. Of course, it's very freely available. I mean, CBD is the hot topic right now. It's legal everywhere in the country. But I really caution parents once again to ensure that the product they're seeking is medical quality, because unfortunately there's a lot of products that are not optimal.
Yeah.
And so
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second there. We talked about this on my last guest who was doing the cannabis series. And one of the things she explained was that CBD just kind of reacts on the outside of the brain receptors, and THC is needed to actually open the brain receptors so that the medicine can get in. So one of the things that I've been talking about to people a lot lately, feeling very passionate about explaining this, is just for that reason, because you can find CBD everywhere. You can find CBD at your gas station. You can find it at Walmart's almost. I mean, it's really inundated everywhere. So people see CBD as the hero, and they see THC as the villain. It's becoming kind of villainized in this way. Like, you don't want the THC. How would we remedy that by including THCA into the medicine so that it can get into the receptors and actually do something else besides just mellow us and make us feel a little bit calm?
Right. And so what I teach is criteria that are supported by research that explain what we want for medical quality cannabis. And we call it our flow criteria. It's flower derived, lab tested, organic, and whole plant. And when we apply those criteria specifically to CBD, what that means is we want flower derived, so no industrial hemp. And there are several reasons behind them. It has to do with potency, has to do with the number of therapeutic compounds that it can produce. In a flower, it can be upwards of 500 therapeutic compounds. We want it lab tested, and this is to rule out any contaminants, and, also so we know what's actually in there, because you can't go by its strain names. Plant can swap really easily in a grow room. As a grower, I can attest to that. And so you want that lab testing. You want it organic, obvious reasons. You don't want to be adding toxins to anybody's situation. And then whole plant. And so this is where, as a whole plant concentrate, you want all of those 500 potential therapeutic compounds in that final product. And so anything that is taking, a hemp plant, which, USDA hemp allowances are 0.3% THC to still qualify as hemp and still be legal everywhere. And you want that 0.3% THC. It does work in congruence with the CBD and makes it more effective. And this is true of the other plant components that often get stripped away during isolation techniques and, even CO2 extraction, which, with CO2, you end up with about a dozen compounds in the final product. Isolate, you end up with one compound. And so, having that synergy of all of those components of the plant is really going to give you the deepest effect. And, there are parents that are hesitant because they're in a state that is not legal for THC. They don't want to risk, involving legal trouble in their situation and making it even worse. And so sometimes they'll just want that CBD isolate with no THC. They want to be 100% certain their child, if tested, will not test positive for THC. But I always explain that while that might be helpful for some superficial symptom management, it's not going to give the same depth of benefits as a whole plant formulation might do.
Now, how is what you're talking about different from like Rick Simpson oil? Because I'm a layperson here, so I need to ask these questions for people like myself who don't have this background. But yes. when you hear about Rick Simpson oil curing cancer and being really a high level kind of grade medical substance, what do you think about Rick Simpson oil? And is this something that we should seek out for treatment for everyone of all ages, or is it something that should really just be used by adults?
When I hear the term Rick Simpson oil, I always want to dig a little deeper. I want to know what solvent was used to produce that medicine, that concentrate, because Rick Simpson promotes use of some really caustic and toxic solvents like naphtha and acetone and isopropyl alcohol. And, especially with some of the bigger commercial producers, there's really no regulatory oversight to ensure that they are batch testing each time they make a formula. And so if there's any residual solvent left in those formulations, it can cause really big problems for patients, especially if they're already sick. You don't want to be adding toxins to their body. So I only recommend formulations that are food grade ethanol extracted. And the ethanol is completely purged during the process, so there's no ethanol left in that final product. And then, for things like cancer, of course, and we call it full extract cannabis oil to differentiate it from RSO and those methods. Although RSO and full extract cannabis oil, those terms are used kind of interchangeably in the industry. And once again, there's really no regulatory oversight about these terms and what they mean and when they can be used. So there is a lot of deceptive marketing going on, unfortunately. But with FICO and RSO, with a cancer patient, that might be appropriate because they need pretty intensive dosing that they build up to. And with the concentrates, you kind of estimate an average of 500 milligrams per mil. in these concentrates. And so they're extremely difficult to accurately dose and accurately titrate. So I tend to refer even cancer patients to a tincture form of that product, or basically they've taken the concentrate and diluted it down into a carrier oil. And the carrier oil can actually improve the efficacy of the cannabis as well, depending on what they use. So there's some added benefit there. And with a tincture, you can literally count the number of drops you're putting under your tongue or in a capsule, and you have exact dosing. So that's another big advantage of the tinctures. So I tend to send clients that direction.
There's so much we need to know. I'm talking to Janna Champagne. She's a cannabis nurse, and her website is Integrated Holistic Care. You can go visit her website and find out some helpful sources. Now, I want to continue the talk on the autism because I think this is really something that's kind of breaking new on the medical front. As it becomes legalized across the country, we're going to start having medical people all over the place be in need of understanding this, and as well as families and parents and people, because the stigma that cannabis is such a horrible, evil plant has been laid on us for so long that we really just have been brainwashed to believe it's just a really awful plant. It's a drug. We shouldn't be using it. But now that's starting to change as states go legal and people become more informed. How you were just recently involved with the Ryan's Law, correct?
Correct, yes.
So I'd like to talk about that next too. Let's go right into that, actually. So tell us about Ryan's Law, what it is, what your involvement was, and what it means for the rest of us.
Okay, so Ryan's Law in California, it's SB 305, and this is a law that, if passed, it's still in process, and looking very positive and very probable that it will pass in California. And once that occurs, it will allow patients the option to take cannabis while in a hospital. And so this is huge because it's really going to open up the mainstream need to learn about cannabis, which up to this point, it's been very limited. The endocannabinoid system is not taught in medical schools, and this presents huge challenges for patients who might go to their doctor, and where cannabis might be a really optimal option for them. The doctor has never heard of the endocannabinoid system, and he doesn't know about cannabis except for the stigma and what he's heard. And, with cannabis being Schedule I, a lot of doctors are fearful around even mentioning it because they require a specific licensure, a federal licensure, in order to even recommend a Schedule I substance in most states. The exception being, states that have medical cannabis laws and the doctor might be willing to sign. But that's not mainstream. So this is going to bring, patient rights to the forefront and make hospitals realize that they need to start taking the endocannabinoid system and cannabis therapy seriously. And my involvement with SB 305, I met Ryan Bartel a couple of years ago. I was his nurse. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, very late stage, and he consulted with me. And unfortunately, he did end up passing on. But his father saw the benefits of cannabis for easing his pain and really saw, Ryan had started the cannabis, was doing well, and then went into the hospital and could no longer use it because the hospital was not supportive. And during that time when he had to be off of the cannabis, he had a downward spiral in his health, and he ended up succumbing to the cancer. So his father took it upon himself to really advocate for cannabis to be allowed in hospitals. This is how he's honoring his son's memory. And as a little bit of an aside, it kind of works as a segue into our previous conversation. I didn't even know this when I spoke with Brian. I mean, when I was consulting, my focus was how can I help him? I want to help his health. I found out after the fact that he was considered an autism whisperer, that he worked in special education and was just brilliant working with kids with autism. So we had some common ground there that we didn't even know about. And I was fortunate to meet Mr. Bartel, his father, at the Cannabis Nurses Network conference. And I've been helping, through letters of support and those sorts of input to help support SB 305. And there are efforts now to duplicate that legislation in Oregon and Washington as well.
Well, thank you so much for your work with that and for helping all of us move forward by being so involved. Autism over the last decade or so has become increasingly more and more. What are your thoughts on what we're really facing as far as our autistic population growing so fast, especially in recent years?
There are dozens of causes of autism. This is why we haven't pinpointed one cause. And it's really intricate. It's the combination of genetic mutations, some of which, by the way, impact the endocannabinoid system, and environmental factors. So it's sort of this perfect storm scenario where a child has a genetic weakness to an environmental factor, and then you bring that environmental factor in, and boom, they end up having system insult from that combination of factors. And this is another area where I specialize, is reading human genetics and making nutrigenomic recommendations to help offset some of the impact of those mutations. It's huge. It's huge. And, environmental factors, things like glyphosate that we find in GMO foods, is a huge topic by Stephanie Senex. She's a PhD at MIT, and she talks a lot on that topic. So that's one big potential influence. Of course, we could go down the road of vaccinations, and there's a lot of parents that are convinced that is potentially involved in their child's regression. But really, when we look at our environment, I really believe these kids are sort of like canaries in the coal mine. They're telling us that some of our environmental processes and our neglect of our environment needs to change because it's not sustainable. And Stephanie Seneff has actually predicted that by 2025, which now is only in 6 years away, 1 in 2 live births will have autism. So if we don't change something pretty quickly, we are on a trajectory of, worsening health of our future generations.
Well, then we have to think about the economic costs and autism in adulthood. I'm just going to read some statistics here from autismspeaks.org. It says here, autism in adulthood, over the next decade, an estimated 500,000 teens, approximately 50,000 each year, will enter adulthood and age out of school-based autism services. They also continue to say teens with autism receive healthcare transition services half as often as those with other special healthcare needs. Young people whose autism is coupled with associated medical problems are even less likely to receive transition support. So as these kids grow up into adults, their symptoms don't go away, their diagnosis doesn't go away. So how do you see our culture embracing and integrating autism in adulthood as they age out of the childhood spectrum?
Yeah, this is a tough issue. And with my daughter being 17, it's something I've been thinking about the last few years. And what I'm doing here in Oregon is launching a cannabis care home model for autism specifically. And our first home is expected to launch next summer. So, I really just want to put it out there that we need to start considering cannabis as a first-line intervention for autism instead of turning right to the pharmaceuticals, which, the mental health pharmaceuticals, the antipsychotics, they come with a really long list of really terrible side effects. Look up extrapyramidal symptoms, for example. And they're not researched for use in children, period, much less children with autism. So we don't know the long-term effects of those medications. Where with cannabis, we have this history of, 5,000 years or more of cannabis use cultures around the world across the lifespan. So its safety profile is very well founded. So I think it could be a huge answer for this crisis and for these kids that are transitioning to adulthood, and we don't have a lot of answers for them. The services, as you mentioned, are very expensive. ABA therapy is $160 an hour for my daughter. So, these are things that are not sustainable for parents usually who are overwhelmed and trying to manage their child's care. And, it's really difficult to have both parents in the family working. So there's usually, a lot of financial strain around that. And, we need to start looking for better answers for these kids, or it's just going to overwhelm our ability to care for them.
It's a definite thing. I mean, it's the cost of caring for Americans with autism is projected to rise to $461 billion by 2025.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have to talk about our healthcare system and all of the wonderful topics that can come up with that. I
Gosh,
mean,
so
it's a
broken.
huge thing. It's very overwhelming. But for people who are dealing with it day to day in their everyday lives, it
Mhm.
is probably much more so, I can imagine. So, what do you? How does autism affect the family unit? We hear stories about it being very difficult for parents to co-parent children with
Mhm.
autism, or even a child with autism, and having other children without autism. Could you speak to a little bit about the experience that you may have, or you may have from your clients, about how autism can affect the family unit?
Sure. And so another statistic, 85% of marriages that have a child with autism end because of that reason, because of the stress of that and the different responses parents might have. You know, oftentimes one parent might, jump right in and start researching and trying to find answers to help the child, or the other parent might go into denial, and that can create resentment and make one parent feel like it's all on them and they're doing it alone. Siblings, of course, there's a lot of challenges because a child with autism, parenting them takes the effort of multiple children. And so I've raised 5 children total, and my one child with autism took more effort than the other 4 that I parented. Just to give you an example.
I'm
It's
sure. Yeah, I'm sure.
very intensive. And, the other thing, with autism, it's the parents of kids with autism are said to have PTSD levels that equal that of combat soldiers. So there's a lot of trauma that occurs parenting a child with autism. There's a lot of chronic grief. And Leo Buscaglia wrote a book on this topic called The Disabled and Their Parents. And it talks about how, you get to a level of acceptance where you feel like you're through the grief phase of losing the child you expected to have. And then something will happen and the grief comes back because you get this reminder that, oh my gosh, I lost my child that I was expecting to have. So there's just so much that parents deal with. And I have to tell you, this role is not for the faint of heart. It takes a very resilient parent to survive this intact. And, in my case, really finding answers that have helped my child and being able to help other parents and other patients using that information has given so much purpose to what we went through, and that has been extremely therapeutic.
Well, it's good to know that cannabis offers a way out of the despair and gives some hope to people dealing with this so that they can have some movement forward in getting, I don't know if better is the right word, because we're dealing with a spectrum disorder that will affect these kids for the rest of their life, correct?
Yes.
Autism isn't something that goes away, right? It's something that stays with the person their entire lives. So are we looking at cannabis as a symptom manager, something that helps the body come back into balance so that it can be more resilient and functioning? Is that really what we're doing here? Is we're looking for solutions to offer and accommodate this? I don't even think it's a disease. It's a genetic disorder. So this is something that we just have to deal with forever, correct?
For most kids, it's a lifelong disorder. There are parents that have reported that their child has fully recovered. And there's an assessment tool called ATEC where you can go in and sort of determine your child's severity and track their progress. A lot of parents are having success using biomedical interventions that are really targeting those imbalances that occur in the body that are causing the symptoms of autism. And so, I consider most kids with autism to have underlying medical imbalances. And if they're targeted correctly and, you find just the right answer for that child's puzzle, sometimes you can pull them out of it, but it's exceptionally rare. But with cannabis, what we find is 9 times out of 10, it can provide relief to the family. It can provide, improvement in the symptoms of autism, and sometimes even in the underlying function. And so it's really, our kids with autism have endocannabinoid deficiency. They need supplementation of the vital nutrient that is cannabis. And that can really help to target some of those underlying contributors to those symptoms of autism. So I believe it has, the term I use is potentially curative benefits as well as symptom management.
So much to take on. It's such a big topic. I don't think we could really, we're just denting the surface, aren't we, really? I really just feel like that a lot of people just don't have any idea what to do when it comes to autism and cannabis. They like the fact that it helps people, that parents report that the symptoms are lessened and that they're able to live a more normal life. But we're really kind of looking at a transformation of the human species, aren't we? Because once we start going into genetic disorders that are coming out and increasing, then we're really, where do you see this in 20 years? I mean, where do you see autism in 20 years? Do you see the population having to deal with this more and more and more and more, and us changing accordingly? Or do you see cannabis coming in as kind of a hero and helping so that we don't quite have to change everything?
Well, I'm an optimist, and while cannabis, of course, can be a really profound benefit for autism, I think this is our wake-up call, and it's teaching us that we need to make changes if we want to continue on this earth as humans. We need to change how we're handling our earth and handling our environment. And you keep saying genetic, which of course I agree with. Genetic mutations are sort of the foundation that allow autism to occur, but there's a study called epigenetics, and it's the environmental impact on genes. So environmental exposures, whether positive or negative, can change gene expression. It can turn on genes that might allow some negative health impact. It can turn off genes that might allow negative impact. And so the environmental piece is really profound in autism. And it's how prolific it is in our country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't, get me started. We can spend the next 20 minutes of the show talking about that, because I really get what you're saying.
The University of Berkeley has done a lot of studies on this topic if you want to delve deeper.
Yeah, I might have to talk to that person too, because really, let's face it, guys. I mean, our environment is contaminated, and you can't stick your head in the sand on this one. We got to really take a good look at our food supply, the quality of our water, what we're consuming, our air. I mean, these basic things that we have a right to stand up and protect. And it just seems more and more our leadership is just stepping away from caring about these things and going into a complete and total irresponsible stance when it comes to this. And anybody that wants to stand up and speak out to it tends to be kind of marked as a troublemaker, and their life begins a whole nother slew of problems. Yeah. But when we really think about it, we have more than just a right to talk about this. We have a need to talk about this, because this has to be the real talk. We have to be able to say, look at what's happening to our children. Look what's happening to the genetics of our children and how these things are expressing themselves. And you're absolutely right. When we have to wake up and take a look at what's going on. Now, I'm going to bring up the big bad word vaccines, and I'm going to probably piss a lot of people off, but I don't care, because we need to have this conversation. Now, when I was a child, many, many decades ago, my mother would take me to the pediatrician, and I found an old prescription for yellow vegetables. So I had to start yellow vegetables at 6 months or whatever age it was for. And there was, it was just a kind of a funny thought, because I said, you never see this now. You don't see doctors writing prescriptions for vegetables or nutrition. And my mom nursed me. So nursing actually is one of the larger and your first experience to endocannabinoids. I mean, you get endocannabinoids from breast milk. Yes. And if we're not breastfeeding, and after years and years of our culture turning away from breastfeeding, demonizing breastfeeding, it's really ridiculous. It's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And how anybody can really take away what's natural, what's a human right, and make it a bad thing is just ridiculous. We see it all the time. But where do we go from here? I mean, it's such a big thing, But when you take on the food supply, you take on vaccines, you take on now you have to get, I think, how many vaccines do you have to get now through school? I know it's gone up quite a bit since I was in school.
Yeah. It's about 4 times that what I received as a child, and I'm 45.
And why? Why is it 4 times more?
Money.
Oh, that. Right.
True in this case as well. And, people don't realize that back in the 80s, vaccinations, the vaccine manufacturers went to our government and said they were going to stop making vaccines because they are, quote unquote, this is in the government documents, unavoidably unsafe. And they were getting sued and they couldn't afford to continue making them because of all of the problems they were causing in our population. And so the government took the liability away from vaccine manufacturers and created what's called the Vaccine Injury Funds to compensate those that can prove they're harmed by vaccines, which, by the way, is exceedingly difficult to do. About 95% of cases that go to the vaccine injury court to try to get those funds are denied. So what we don't realize is that vaccine injury fund is taxpayer funded. The vaccine have zero liability for harm. And since that legislation went through, I believe it was in 1986, it was late 80s, the vaccine schedule has quadrupled. So
I have a problem with this, and I hope everybody listening has a problem with this too, because, how can that not be considered a factor? 4 times more vaccines in your school age years than ever before.
Yep.
God,
and none of the vaccines have been researched for efficacy or safety. The one research study they did I think it was released in 2002, was on only the MMR vaccine, not even in combination with other vaccines like they're doing to these babies. The MMR vaccine, the outcomes were actually changed after the fact. This is on the Congress floor right now. They are investigating the CDC because they changed the data after the fact to hide a 350% increase in autism just with the MMR vaccine in kids where it was given before age 3. After age 3, that did not occur. And instead of the CDC taking the reins on this and changing the MMR scheduling to after age 3, they swept the data under the rug, changed it, and now the person who was the head of the CDC vaccine division at that time is a top executive with top pay at Merck Vaccine Manufacturing. When
it makes me want to scream.
You'd be an idiot not to question what is going on behind the scenes here.
Well, this then leads to our government and leadership, and I don't believe in blaming one person for anything. This is definitely a buildup over time.
Mm-hmm.
Multiple leaders have had problems and parts to play in this, and all parties. This isn't just the Democrat. Everybody can get so caught up in the debate and argument of who's to blame, but they still get nothing done. So it's great to talk about it and argue about it, but you get nothing done. So if I were a parent and I had a child coming and I didn't want to participate in this nonsense, homeschool is an option. But then when you go to college and you don't have your vaccine record in order, they don't let you in. So how has our education system has really just backed us up into a corner so that we are forced to abide by these rules, and kids have to have them for certain things. So what do you do then? Don't go to college? Is there homeschool college? Can you go to college without having to prove your vaccine? And then you have to deal with the stigma and all this. So really, how do we change this gigantic problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, fortunately, most states still allow philosophical or medical exemptions of vaccination. And I just really encourage parents to be well informed. Follow Robert F. Kennedy. He is very outspoken about the problems in Washington that are contributing to this. And I just saw a post by him recently that cited that the Congress has double the lobbyists and the lobbying money for drug manufacturers and vaccine manufacturers versus the next largest industry, which is oil and gas. So this is why we're having difficulty making change in this area. There's so much money at stake, and there's such an entanglement between pharmaceutical companies and vaccine manufacturers and our political campaign contributions. So anytime there's a politician that's pro-vaccine or pro-pharmaceuticals, and anti-cannabis kind of comes along with that, because cannabis is the number one competitor to all pharmaceuticals, in my opinion.
Agreed.
And
I agree in that.
Campaign contributions, they're out in the open, they're publicly listed. 9 times out of 10, those pharmaceutical companies are one of their top contributors. So they're being paid to have that paradigm. They're not thinking logically. They're not looking at the facts. They're being paid to ignore them.
Agreed.
So we just need to be informed as citizens and protect our families, because our government is not going to do so. They're being paid not to.
No, and you see that more and more. And even with Trump, it doesn't, again, I'm going to say it doesn't matter really who's in charge, because they all do it. I mean, this isn't just a Trump issue. This isn't just an Obama issue or a Bush issue. This just goes back for a very long time. This is about money being given and infused to control outcome by corporate entities that want and have monopolies on all of these things. So cannabis really is the number one enemy of the pharmaceutical companies, because of all of the success it has in treating all of these different disorders and symptoms of health-related issues, mental-related issues, psychological, everything, all parts of it, even emotional. And they won't let it come in. They are doing everything they can to stop it.
It has them shaking in their boots, because they know. I mean, I believe that's the reason cannabis was taken off of the market in 1937 to begin with, was because it was such a huge competitor to so many different industries, not just medical and pharmaceuticals, but also paper and trees and oil and gas. And I mean, it has so many uses. And when people realized that our country was founded on hemp, they would give people land as long as they would grow hemp on their land. George Washington grew hemp, for God's sakes. In realizing the impact on our population of removing cannabis from, where it used to be anyone could go to a drugstore and purchase it over the counter, to where it's no longer available, and not just as medicine, but also in our food supply. I mean, we used to feed hemp to cows and chickens, so it would be in our milk and our meat and our eggs, and that has all completely stopped.
And now we have antibiotics.
Right.
I mean, so, it's really something. It's something.
What we've done is really destroy the ability of our population to keep our bodies in balance, and this has led to an epidemic of chronic illness across the board. And with autism specifically, cannabis was removed from the market in 1937 after being used across the lifespan for generations. And the first write-up of autism in a medical journal occurred in 1941 by a doctor who first saw symptoms in 1939. Very closely correlated. And, that combined with the research showing that cannabis is endocannabinoid, or autism is endocannabinoid deficiency, that mutations in the endocannabinoid system cause autism, that kids with autism have anandamide deficiency, which is the endocannabinoid that's synonymous with THC from the plant. All of those, plus more of these research studies, have me convinced that if we hadn't taken cannabis off of the market, and if we weren't suffering multi-generational endocannabinoid deficiency, that autism might not exist today.
Oh, wow. I have to agree with you on that one.
Yeah,
I think that's really important. In fact, if anybody listening gets anything out of this show, please take note of that, because the endocannabinoid deficiency that we're seeing, and the fact that our doctors aren't even taught the endocannabinoid system, it just really feels like the greatest conspiracy ever to take and demonize this plant medicine, which probably has healing effects going all the way back to even further than we can imagine, as part of apothecary and holistic practices, which has all been demonized, of course, and turned into something that the FDA and the pharmaceutical companies chase after to try to absolutely obliterate off of the market. I mean, how many times have people offered really good remedies for things that don't include pharmaceuticals that are shut down by the FDA simply because they can? I mean, it's something that we really have to take a bigger and better look at. And I don't hear any presidential candidates talking about this. I don't hear any debates on this topic, and it's discouraging. And quite frankly, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but I'm sick of it, and I'm sick and tired of the government just overpassing the topics that we really want them to address. And I have to say, autism, cannabis legalization, pharmaceutical intervention, all of this stuff has to be put back into its proper place, and everything needs to be reorganized. And I don't know how that's going to happen, because everything is so compartmentalized that we just aren't able to act efficiently without going through hoops and hoops and hoops of red tape, right?
Right. Absolutely. And, you know, our government knows that cannabis has the potential to revolutionize our broken healthcare system. And, you know, our current system's approach to autism is really flawed. I mean, we have these compartments in our mainstream medical system where we have the neurologist that doesn't want to step out of his neuro box, and the gastroenterologist that doesn't want to step out of his GI box, and the immunologist that wants to stay in his box, and they're not looking at how these systems interact. So that's another huge problem with our medical system. But then looking at cannabis, and, you know, you see the pharmaceutical companies catching on to cannabis, but what they're doing is basically bastardizing the plant, isolating it, which they know by research makes it less effective. They're putting these enormous price tags on it. The GW Epidiolex is $32,000 a year to start, and it's showing to be less effective for seizures versus a whole plant, which works at 20 to 25% of the dose and starts at $1,500 a year.
How can they justify that? I mean, seriously, Janna, how can they justify that? That statistic right there should say so much, and yet they won't. They're withholding, not to mention the fact that the government owns most of the patents on remedies and cannabis itself. So we're really up against a huge fight. I see it coming. I see it here. A lot of people like yourself are doing really good things in this effect, and are having an effect on it. And still, I see more and more resistance by big money, big corporations, big government, and meddling into our medical affairs and all of this stuff. So I have a really strong opinion about it, in case you can't tell when I go into these topics.
So it makes sense. When you're informed, you realize the downside of having so many companies that are only profit focused. All they care about is that bottom line and making money. And it's a very different approach versus nurses like myself, who are patient focused and patient advocates. We tend to approach it very differently. And just for the record, I don't benefit from the sales of any product. I've launched my Cannabis Nurse Approved program to highlight medical quality cannabis products for patients and help suppliers as well to improve their quality. And, you know, this is all based on patient needs, and where I'm seeing, you know, that there are still outstanding problems with patients and their ability to access medical cannabis.
Yeah, well, we're out of time. So I want to say thank you, Janna Champagne, for coming on and talking. If you'd like more information about her and her work and like to speak to her about your particular case, you can reach her at integratedholisticcare.com. Please share your stories. We need to hear them. This is so important. We have to move forward, educated and empowered. I'm Hillary Raimo. This is Real Talk Radio on KCAA. And until next time, be well.
Thank you, Hillary.